Hi, welcome to the Inspire and Ignite series with Safe States Alliance. This month focuses on finding and writing grants. You've arrived at part 1, our pre-recorded webinar with speaker Dr. Kevin Rix. At the end of the recording, make sure to take our survey to tell us what you thought and what questions are still on your mind. And after that, register for part 2, our peer-led discussion on April 30th. Hope you enjoy.
Hello, my name is Kevin Rix. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. I'd like to thank the Safe States Alliance for inviting me to talk to you all today around finding and writing non-federal/government grants. I'm hopeful that this presentation today will be informative for some, especially for those who are looking to potentially get into the grant space. A few things before I start my presentation. First, I'd like to make a couple disclosures that I am currently funded by both federal and non-federal entities. This presentation is not going to specifically talk about any of my current funding mechanisms. Rather, it's a snapshot overview of considerations for seeking non-federal funding. I also want to disclose that my views do not necessarily reflect the views of my grant funders, as these are my perspectives on finding and writing grants. So before we get going, let's say first things first. I think when I start talking about grants, and something when I didn't even realize when I first got into the grant world, is how time-consuming writing, applying for, getting, and managing grants can be. I think as you go down the grant space, you're going to find that grants take up a lot more time that you may not necessarily have considered. If you're somebody with already a really packed schedule who doesn't have time to do a lot of extra management, grants can be an extra burden that you may not be anticipating. So first, know how time-consuming a grant's going to be, from the idea stage all the way to actually getting a grant. Secondly, grants are resource intensive. And when I say that, I don't just mean that they require you to get a lot of resources in grants. They require a lot of your resources before you even apply for a grant, whether that, as I mentioned, is your time or your staff's time or the work you've already done or getting foundational data for a grant. Having a really competitive grant takes a lot of formative resources that you may not be able to expend. If you can, that's great. And you may be at the point where finding a grant and writing a grant is the right place for you, but know that it's going to take a lot of your resources up front. Third, especially in today's environment, grants are becoming incredibly and extremely competitive. Just because you find a grant that you are really excited about or know about does not mean that grant is likely to get funded. It does mean, however, that you're going to have to write a really competitive application. For whatever the entity that you're going for is, know that grants are going to be probably applied for by 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 other applicants who also find the same grant opportunity exciting to them. So going in, know that a grant is nowadays a very, very competitive process. Just because you find a grant doesn't mean you'll end up getting the funding for it. So that means you could put a lot of time in and not actually see any money on that round. Fourth, you should know that grants favor people with track records. What does that mean? It means that people who have a history of writing grants and getting grants often continue to spiral and compound those grants down the line. And why is that? Is because funders see people with previous grants as an opportunity to work with someone who has executed a grant from beginning to completion. Doesn't mean if you've never had a grant before, you can't get a grant. However, they tend to favor people who have shown the ability to execute a project from beginning to end. Fifth, grants really are a supplement to your work. If you're just getting started in the injury and violence prevention area, I don't recommend your first thought being, I need to go get a grant. Unless your organization tells you, I want our work to be grant funded, grants are a good supplement to work. They're a good way to take a very basic level program and take it to the next level, whether that be multiplying the amount of effort and resources you're putting in, whether that's doing an evaluation, whether that's creating something brand new. Grants are an opportunity to supplement the great work you're already doing. And at Safe States, we have a lot of people doing a lot of great work. This is an opportunity to really expand on it. I do not recommend the first thought you have in a new job, especially for any of our new injury and violence prevention coordinators or professionals out there, to think my first role should be, I need to go get a grant, unless your organization is telling you, go get a grant, write a grant. The last piece is that grants are, even to me, sometimes really challenging to find and write. I've been fortunate to be successful in getting grant funding in the past. They're still very, very challenging. There is no repertoire in the non-federal space of just all the non-federal grant funds that exist out there. And the reason is that because they're always changing. Those locations are always new to even to the people who write grants all the time. Opportunities emerge, opportunities disappear very, very quickly. The one thing I will say is that for the non-federal grants, they tend to go much faster in that the timelines emerge very quickly and you only have a short amount of time to get the grant submitted and written. If you're in an organization that has a lot of steps that you need to go through, your best opportunity is to have these grants kind of in the bag, ready to go in case something emerges. Because once you find it, you may only have 20 or 30 days to execute the entire proposal. That's not always true, but I found especially in some of the foundation and private grants, they put a shorter timeline on these things. Well, now that I've gone through some of the kind of the basic fundamentals of understanding why grants may be important to you, I want you to ask yourself a couple things. Like the primary thing you should be trying to ask is, what are you trying to accomplish by going after a grant? Do you need materials to do your programs? Are you out there trying to do a child passenger safety program and need more car seats? Are you trying to get more bike helmets for bike events? Is it a material thing that you are physically needing to execute your program? Is it personnel? Are you trying to get a grant to hire someone? This is typically the hardest one because this usually requires showing some level of sustainability to that person won't just be losing their job the moment that the grant is over. A lot of times we use grants to fund things like child passenger safety technicians or technician courses because we need more of them. But are you trying to get those people full time or on a part-time basis? Is it a person you're trying to get? Are you trying to use your grant to get data? Are you trying to use it to synthesize what your data looks like? If you work in a hospital setting, is your grant focused around getting data or using the data you already have? Or finally, is your grant focused around a program? Whether that's the big programs we talk about or the little programs that we talk about, big being your full injury violence prevention program, or the little p, the ones that are inside your program. Are you trying to use it to actually execute a program? I once worked in falls prevention programs. We used a grant one time to get us off the ground to get the program running because there was a licensing fee. So we found a small grant that allowed us to pay for that license. Sometimes the grants are needed to be able to show value to a community, and those are ones that typically have the smaller amounts of budgets, but can usually be funded more often. The type of grant and the thing you're looking to accomplish by a grant is going to dictate where you then go looking for a grant. Materials, personnel, data, and programs are all funded by different entities with different missions and different goals. So starting with understanding what is your actual accomplishment that you're trying to show will help just steer you into the direction of where you need to go next. In the injury and violence prevention world, there's two types of grants I want you to consider. The first is research grants. And I apologize that I realize that my bottom of my screen is cut off here. Two types of grants to consider. The orange bar at the bottom that's unfortunately covered by my webpage says both are important but different. The first are research grants. So I am an assistant professor at a university setting. These are where predominantly where my grants are focused on. I'm looking to do interventions. I'm looking to look at data. I'm looking to do an evaluation. I want to do a focus group or an interview. The other type, which is much more common in the injury and violence prevention practitioner world, are the programmatic grants. Maybe you need motor vehicle restraints like car seats. Maybe you're looking to fund a new life jacket. Maybe you want to start training up child passenger safety technicians. Maybe you want to do a fall prevention course. The programmatic grants typically have different funding mechanisms than the research grants. However, both sets of grants can range from very small amounts of money, typically where the programmatic ones fall, to really large amounts of money, millions of dollars when it comes to 5-6 year research projects. It's important to consider what you're looking to do with the grant. Sometimes you may have this really great idea for a program. and you may not find anything that aligns. However, a research grant may be really a nice add-on if you can add a research component. If you want to evaluate how that program's going, you may be able to shift into the research spectrum. That adds another level of complexity. But when you're thinking about where you can go and get grants, think about what is you're trying to accomplish at the end, whether that be some type of programmatic effort, or do you want to conduct some research? For me, I typically live a lot in the research space, but the programmatic grants are really, really out there for you to go to help do your injury violence prevention programming. So when you think about writing a grant, and so this is kind of the foundation for all grants. It's not in every single grant, but most grants will follow this 7-step formula for what they're looking for. If you've never written a grant, this is kind of how you should start thinking about what you're going to write about, whether you're looking for something that's programmatic or research. The first is an introduction. So who are you? What are you writing about? You want to tell whoever you're looking to get funding what is the important things about you that make you want to apply for this grant. Why are you coming to me? Why are you asking for money? What are the things that you need to do in order to that I'm coming to you in the first place? Once you explain who you are and why you're doing what you're doing, you want to craft what we call specific aims. A lot of the times, this is where most grants start. You know who you are, so why not start with writing up your specific aims? These are the exact things you're going to produce. Typically, most grant applications have 2 or 3 specific aims. So for example, if you're looking for car seats, you're looking for child passenger safety seats, you may want to write, we are going to deliver X number of child passenger safety seats or child passenger safety restraints in our community. We are going to pass out X number of programs. We're going to host 10 different events. You want to be very specific as to what you're going to do with the money that you're asking for. That way, the funder can say the aims of this project, the things that this program is focusing on, and what they're going to use our money for will lead to these outcomes. Third is the significance. Why are you doing any of this? What does it matter? And why should it matter? This is real. Sometimes this is what we call the storytelling part of the grant. We and oftentimes think everything we're doing matters a lot, but we don't do a good job of conveying that to the funders or people outside our close sphere. So in the significance section, you want to explain why this is important, what is needed, what have you found out already that makes it so if I give you this money, we can fill a hole. A lot of the times what we're looking for in grants is to fix some small thing that we have identified already. We need to clearly explain that to the funder as to why their money can go into those areas. And the way we do that is we describe what's called innovation. How will this be different than every other thing that's already been done? It doesn't have to just be a brand new invention or a brand new program, but maybe it's a new application. Maybe you're trying a community that hasn't been touched before. Maybe you are working with a new community partner that's never had access to certain resources. So your innovation section really says, how is this different from everything else that hasn't already filled this gap? Why is it doing this in a new way likely to produce the results you think they're going to produce? Then your fifth is your approach. These are the physical steps you're going to go through to actually execute on your grant. You're going to tell your funder, these are the important things that we are going to do step by step along the way, including giving them a timeline. What do you need to execute it, whether it's hiring people, whether it's conducting some formative work that you are going to do to get their project out the door. What are the steps from start to finish over the course of whatever length of time that will produce whatever thing you say are your specific aims? 6, you're going to describe your team and your environment. Are you the right people in the right place? Just because you may think you are the right people, a funder may not realize that. So you need to explain as to why the group that you're putting forward to work on this project are the right people to do it. And this also includes, are you in the right environment to do it? Not every single person is in the environment in which they can successfully get a grant out the door. Maybe you don't have support from administration of your organization. Maybe you haven't thought about asking them for it. Maybe you are too new in the field and haven't thought through all the the challenges that may. You may need to bring in someone who's a little bit more experienced to talk through it. Maybe you're not as much of an expert in one area, but you need that expert in there. You need to explain to the funder why you have the right people to execute the grant that you are applying for. And finally, obviously, this is all comes down to the budget. How much is this all going to cost? Typically, with a grant, you're given some level of funding that you're going to try to target within, and you should know and explain how every single dollar you're going to spend is going to cost. These are just kind of very basic fundamentals of writing a grant. But if you've never thought about the actual components, I typically think about them in these 7 steps. And this leads me to thinking about whether or not, when I start looking for grants, is the grant going to fit me personally? Not every grant, no matter how great you may be, is the right fit for you. And the reason that is because sometimes you have a different mission. Maybe you are overburdened with a lot of things. You're like, if I get a grant, I can work through getting one more person to do this job. But maybe your capacity isn't there to write the grant at this exact time. Maybe you have too much going on. So if you're overwhelmed, your grant time is going to suffer. You may have to write at times that you're not planning on it. If your capacity, because I've already mentioned how time consuming they are, is not at a level where you can handle managing a grant, it may not be the right fit, even if you have found that this is a grant that you would really like. Maybe it's not in your expertise. I find this a lot with programmatic grants who are looking to work in certain communities. Maybe you're not an expert in the community that they're looking to do. Maybe you want to do a life jacket grant and get funding for life jackets, but the community is actually looking for swimming lessons and the grant is around swimming. And you think maybe I can tweak it so I can do life jackets and swimming lessons. You probably can write it that way, but the funder may not see it that way if they had a clear vision in mind. You may need to get somebody who's more of an expert in swimming lessons on the grant to help you fit your overall idea of what you'd like to do with the money. And thirdly, probably the most important thing to me is will a grant help you achieve either a short-term or long-term goal? It's great to get funding to do a project. However, if you need to be able to clearly delineate what your short and long-term goals are to be able to show sustainability that the grant you're going to do. Just because a grant is a good fit for you, for example, as an injury researcher, I'm always looking for all injury mechanism grants, but maybe I don't have the right expertise in firearm injuries. And that's not my long-term goal to work in firearm related injuries. Maybe it is, maybe yours is different. You want to identify whether or not going through the efforts will help you achieve your short and long-term goals, whatever they may be. This also involves what is your capacity? As a injury and violence prevention professional, I'm aware that you have a lot on your plate at any given time. For those who don't know about me, I'm currently an assistant professor at a university, but my background is I spent 7 years leading an injury and violence prevention program at a level 1 trauma center. During the formative years in the level 1 trauma center, I would not have had the capacity to put together a grant application. I was learning my material. I was learning the craft in which I was trying to work in. My capacity was at the smallest cup. As I grew and became more experienced in the injury and violence prevention world, my cup got bigger and I was able to fill with more because the things I started with earlier were not taking as much of my effort. If you're in a position where your capacity is already filled, adding a grant may only overburden you, and you may not either be able to put in the amount of effort you need towards the grant in the first place, or if you do get the grant, you may not be able to actually execute to the level you thought you were going to be. This takes a critical evaluation of yourself to understand where am I in my program. If I'm ready to expand, a grant may be a great opportunity for you. If you feel like you're close or you don't know where to go next, talk to a mentor, talk to someone who has been in that space and ask them, what do you think about going after a grant in this space? Do you think it will help? Some people will still have to go for a grant because they need the money to execute a program which they've been tasked to do. I understand that. However, if you're giving the option, really it's important to do a self-evaluation of your own capacity. As we sit here in 2025, I think it's important that we also recognize that we need to strategize for the moment that we're in. Understanding the context in which your grant will be reviewed is really important to set your own expectations. I mentioned that modernly grants can get really competitive. And so the reason that is because there are more people going for the same amount of grants or fewer grants than there have been in the past, especially in the injury and violence prevention world. You hear a lot in the news around like the term indirect costs. You should know what you're if when you're applying for a grant, what things like indirect costs mean. What are direct costs? If you're not familiar, direct costs are the products that you can physically show of the grant, the program, the materials, things like that. Indirect costs are things like the lighting or the rent or the staff time of support staff that isn't on the grant itself, those things that are not directly associated with the funding. You need to know what your environment is and what you're able to do, because that will help dictate whether or not you should be going for a grant. It'll help you know whether or not that if your strategy in this exact moment is the right time. Grant writing is largely about timing. It's not only hard, in addition to finding the grant, it's about timing out your grant in general, making sure that when you submit it, you put together your strongest foot forward to actually get the funding, because the amount of effort you're going to put in, you're going to hopefully want to see the funding come out at the end. I think the grants and writing successful grants come down to three things from you. This has nothing to do with the funders themselves. This is three things from you. The first is the ability to paint a picture that is believable and viable. If you don't believe that your grant and you can't describe every aspect of your grant from start to finish, then the funder is not going to know what you're talking about. They're going to make assumptions and they may not be completely aware of all the things that you're aware of. So you need to write in a way that you paint a picture of everything that's going to go in. Secondly, unfortunately, you need to sell yourself. You need to sell your program. You need to sell your abilities. You need to sell that you are the right people at the right place at the right time to execute on a grant. You need to get this point across so the funder can go, okay, I have faith that this program is going, or this money is going to the right person, which leads into the trust aspect. The funder must trust you to execute the program that you say you're going to do. Now, for me, this is where when I say that having a track record is helpful, because you show that you've already done this. Not everyone has that track record. So if you haven't, one way to get in there is start working on other people's projects who may already have a track record. That helps build your own. That's how I got started. I started on other people's grant projects, not leading it, but just being a part of it. So people can say, hey, he's been a part of the grant process. He knows how to execute all the pieces. We trust him one day to go lead it. If you're required to be the lead person because you're in a small institution, you want to get a grant, you need to paint the picture even more clear that your organization is the right people to execute the grant that you're applying for. This all comes down to alignment. So the way someone who's going to read a grant that you write is whether or not what you're saying aligns with the mission and vision of that organization. When we talk about non-federal grants or non-federal grants in general, or non-government grants in general, so some of the things that come from private enterprise or foundation grants, you need to understand that whatever you're writing aligns with the vision of that organization. For whatever reason, they have a mission that they are trying to accomplish for why they're putting this money out. Write to these authors, write to those people, so you can say the project and product we're going to put out for you aligns with what you're saying. If the funder is for saying, I want to work in traumatic brain injury, this is not the opportunity to write a grant that's about vision, potentially, right? It's not a time to write the grant about drowning. This is the time they want to work in traumatic brain injury. You should write your grant in a way that targets traumatic brain injury. Your important here is to make sure that whatever you say aligns with the goals of that organization, because they will only fund goal projects that align with what they're doing. So how will you find these grant opportunities? As I mentioned, no one has a list. No one knows exactly where to go. So the first thing is your network. This to me was always the way that I went about finding my initial grants. Networking with the people who you've worked with for a long time to know where they've previously been funded. Who do you know that's gotten funding from some organization? Where have they gotten funding from? In the private spaces, I rely on my network quite a bit. I have a mentor who sends me when things come across her desk that may be applicable for me to as a potential opportunity. Use your network and tap into them. Look at people's resumes and CVs if they're available. Go on different websites of professionals to understand where have people been funded in the past to give you a sense of how to start. There are a lot of foundations and a lot of private entities that you're not going to be aware of just thinking about it. Some of my funders don't make sense in the way of why would this company want to do this? They do some other mainstream thing because they have another mission, another arm. So thinking about how your network can leverage into what you want to write for a grant. There are many computer softwares out there that will help you identify some grants. One that comes to my mind is a program called Spin. Spin is a grant finding organization, AI program that you can type in a topic and it will pop up. It's largely the same as things like Google, but a little bit more tailored on the grant space. That you can type in an interest and look into whether or not a grant is available in that topic. It not always is, but the more specific you can be, the more likely technology will help you find some of these grants. However, as I mentioned, there is no just great giant list. Lastly is the foundations. A lot of us understand that foundation money and foundation grants exist. There are big ones. Understand the big players is really important. Robert Wood Johnson, Bill and Melinda Gates. Those are very large foundations that have very large endowments who can help potentially get bigger programs off the ground. But also know the smaller players. So for me, when I lived in Austin, the local trauma regional advisory area had a small grant that helped fund ankle weights. It wasn't a lot of money. It wasn't going to fund any of my time to do anything, but it funded the need for ankle weights. So I used that grant to get the ankle weights I needed purchased because I didn't have the budget for it internally. So think about how you will use your grants and where you can tap into. Doesn't always have to be the $1 million grant. Sometimes if you're looking for a small program, a $2,000, a $2,500, a $5,000 grant will get you out the door because they don't have as many of the ties as other grants do. So a lot of times for the people who have never applied for a grant, they don't even know where to start. These are the 4 questions that I would say how I would start if I was starting from scratch, because it's okay to not know where to start if you've never applied for a grant. The first question I'm going to ask is, who are the players in the space I care about? Who cares about drowning? Who cares about traumatic brain injury? Who cares about child passenger safety? Who cares about older adult falls? Whatever your area of interest, start looking into the organizations who you've probably heard their name just by thinking about falls prevention, for example, or drowning prevention. Those organizations will probably list their partners that they may have worked with in the past to help secure funding. Then you should ask whether or not you already know any of those people. Do you have any relationships with the players who may have some funding? In the foundation and business space, I think having a good relationship with the funders is equally important as writing a good project. The reason that is because the people who are reading your programs are real people too who care about the issues. So you need to know who they are and why they care about it and why they should trust you to execute that project. I think people in the private spaces are just as important as anything else, because the more you get to know the people who are actually going to fund you, the more they can build trust in you, the more that you can see that you will execute the project that you're saying you're going to execute. And one day you may have an opportunity to work with them. It doesn't mean you will have that opportunity today if you've never worked in that space before, but you want to build the relationships with those individuals and those organizations, whoever they may be. Then you can ask, how can I start building towards that relationship if you don't have one? Are you going to their events? Are you going to listen to them talk? Are you going to support other projects that they've already funded? As a steward of their funds, how can you show that you are going to take care of the trust that they are putting into you by them giving you money to execute a project? That is foundationally core. Once you build a relationship with a person, it's much easier to start the conversation about what kind of funding opportunities do you have that's out there. You don't have to have them all right away, but I think just knowing who the people are and that they believe in you is really critical in the private and foundation game. And then the last thing do you have any partners who you know that are already involved with something that you can help get your foot in the door by working on their project? Maybe you have a partner who's working with a private entity that is they have a long-standing relationship. Maybe you can be a site for that project. Maybe you can ask if you can work in going up to their community event so you can see how they utilize the resources that are provided. It's okay if you don't have that off the bat or you don't know who those are. One of the things I love about Safe States is that you can tap into this large network of people who have done some of those things. So please tap into the people who have worked with community partners in the past to say, hey, how did you start that conversation? How did you work with them? What are they looking for in their programs and their grant funding? I think this all also comes down to thinking outside the box. Just because you have one way of that you may have been pre-programmed for what a grant could be, doesn't mean that's a one-size-fits-all approach. Maybe there are opportunities with different organizations that you may have never thought about in the past, that this is your first chance to really think about it. When you're going for a grant, there are probably layers to different organizations. What I typically will do is if I find, like, for example, I work in motor vehicle crashes a lot. I want to look at transportation. I will look at big names in transportation and type in foundation after their name because they may have a foundation that I may not have thought about, or they may have a charity department that we can tap into for, hey, do you have a small amount of funds for this? I don't know. You have to think outside the box when it comes to looking for private and non-government grants, purely because they're not as just out there as federal grants typically have been in the past. You also need to know what building blocks you're starting with, because that will allow you to sell yourself a little bit better. What data do you already have? Do you collect data on something that could be interesting? Do you know where all the falls or the helmet issues are in your community? Tap into what data you may already have. What resources do you have? Do you already have a big staff? Do you have a small staff? Is the timing across programs large or is it small? What physical resources can you tap into that, one, if you don't get the grant, you can still build further so you can show growth. So when you do apply again, you can show that you've gotten even stronger. Or maybe this is like, hey, this is my limitation. I'm missing a resource and I can't tap anymore. And that's your indication that you can start going for the grant. And I think almost importantly as anything else is that this is your time to be self-critical when you do start looking for grants. Conduct your evaluation of yourself as a grantor would look at you. And I know that's spelled wrong. I apologize. What would a grant entity look at you and say, if I wanted to immediately get in the world of domestic violence, I have no track record of working in domestic violence prevention. It's not who I am. Even if I think this is a really good opportunity that I could contribute to, I may need to bring in more domestic violence related individuals to help, and I can support them in another way. Maybe I'm not the right person to lead. Maybe I can bring this to a larger entity and say, hey, we have this big program we want to put out. Would you be willing to help lead it, or would you willing to help support me in doing it? Because that will help you know where you can actually start and jump off of. When it actually comes to physically writing the grant, where should you go if you need help? I think the first thing is leverage your community partners. So, for example, if you don't, and this is selfish a little bit, if you don't know who the university people in your community are, I would take time to get to know them, especially if you're a university with a school of public health, because they may have experience writing grants, both programmatic and research. Leverage them to potentially help write one. I promise you, they are probably looking for funding, and community partners out there who are, looking for more effort and more time, they may say, hey, yeah, I can help you write this. I can be involved. I work with a local hospital where I am, and we write grants together to say, hey, we have an idea, we have a project, we'd like to put this out into the world. It'll show collaboration between a university and a hospital environment. Leverage each other, because it only will show a stronger team unity to the funder, as these people have all the right skills needed to execute the grant, especially if it's programmatic, if you want to get out into the community. It also gives you more is if you work with universities, it helps leverage some of those evaluation things that you may want to get into. You may want to be able to turn it into a research grant. And the way you're going to do that is by bringing in a researcher who can do the evaluation, who can validate the scale you're trying to implement. Those are things that I think we often forget about, that you don't have to go into a grant writing by yourself. Things like subawards are things on grants. Subawards are you give a portion of a grant to another entity to help or allow them to help you, even if they're not the co-I or what's called a co-investigator on a grant. If it's research or from a programmatic perspective, they are just a community partner who's going to help conduct one small aspect of the grant, who isn't the full entity getting the large amount of the funding. You also need to recognize your strengths and weaknesses, especially as a writer. I struggle a lot when it comes to getting a lot of the background section out, for example. I typically don't write a lot of the background sections on the grants because I don't tell the story in the way it needs to be told. I bring in someone who I talk it out with them and then they write it. But when it comes to methodology, that's typically my area that I can leverage. Know where you're strong, know where you're weak, and know how you can leverage those pieces to put one stronger grant application together. Know your skills. If you're not skilled in doing a community-based program, don't try to say I'm going to do a community-based program unless you bring in someone who has that experience as well. It's important to be able to really explain why you're strong and where you're weak, be able to bring someone in that helps eliminate that weakness. In our current environment, being adaptable is really key. The grants that are out there are changing every single day. One grant that you may have seen one day is gone the next, or it's had a really short time frame. Being flexible and pivoting is critical. Everything you should write should be flexible and critical around what you want to work in the space. You want to take things as they come. Right now, it can be really hard to know where the next grant is going to emerge, but a lot of these organizations out there have typical calendars. You can look and say, to see at certain organizations, oh, they put out their grants in the spring and in the fall. So I'm going to be ready to go in the spring and the fall, no matter what they say they're looking to fund that year. We don't know what they're going to be, but we are still ready to go. And it's important if you're going to be in the grant space to know how to be adaptable for whatever may come. It also means that right now competition is as critical as you ever possibly can see. You're going to have more people writing for more grants in these spaces than probably in the past. So just keep in mind that when it is more competitive, people are going to be more critical of the writing itself. And perhaps you need more nuance. Maybe you need to add an evaluation to your program. Even if it's the best program in the world, maybe you need to take it another step further and bring in one more person or one more group to work with you on that. So right now is also the time to be more critical of your own writing and say, am I getting the full point across? Because it's going to be a competitive process. That said, in the competitive world, there are times where you're going to put a lot of effort into writing a grant and it will not get funded. The best piece of advice I can give on those moments is to never get too down for an unfunded grant. There's no such thing as a failed grant application. That grant application that wasn't funded this time and wasn't right this moment may be right in the future. Put it in the back burner, get edits, and if you can get feedback from the people who evaluated it, take it. In private and foundational grants, they sometimes don't spend the time to actually put together a full feedback form. Some do. If they do, take the time to understand what they saw and how you can fix it for the future. So the next time it comes up, you have a grant that already has your background, it already has some of your methods going, and then you can run with it with the changes they suggested that you make. Kind of wrapping up. So why get a grant? This is a chance for you to show opportunity for growth and increase value. If you really need funding to survive, whether your program needs to survive or you're trying to keep somebody staffed, that may be a reason that you have to go after a grant. Or you want to be part of something bigger. If you feel like you've gotten to a point where you want to start taking the steps into being part of a bigger capacity, a grant may be a good opportunity for this. If you can get a grant, whether it's programmatic or research, you will find yourself playing in a bigger pond of other people who have worked on the grants. You can explain to other people how you got it. You can talk at the bigger community level. You can do more because honestly, more money equals more opportunity to do injury and violence prevention. If you get it, know that we're all cheering you on to show success because your success will help lead to more funding for injury and violence prevention in the future. Grants can be a lightning bolt into your program. When it's possible, use grants to boost after your fundamentals are in place. Once you know that all your fundamentals are taken care of, you can do all your programs really well. That's when you should go after a grant, unless you are required to. With great power comes great responsibility. That's from Spider-Man 2002. Know that once you have a grant, it is your responsibility to execute it, because what you want to be able to show is a good track record. So the next time it comes up, you're funded again, and maybe next time you're funded even stronger. I'll leave you with my contact information. I'm more than happy to talk about grant and grant writing with you. But I highly encourage, for wherever you are in the world, to talk to people who are local to you. They know your community, they know your projects, they potentially, and if they don't know your projects, explain it to them. Maybe there's an evaluation, maybe there's a new scale that can be implemented, and you can work with them to get those things out. There are researchers all across the country who are looking to work with community-based partners and the injury and violence prevention professional, and I encourage you to find out who those are and make a connection with them. So if you're looking for a grant, you can work together and have an even stronger grant opportunity. I thank you for your time. I appreciate you watching this webinar. If you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you very much.